director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment, an organization she co-founded 15 years ago with Vermont citizens when a large energy project was proposed for a region. After successfully defeating that project, Annette has worked with Vermonters throughout the state to defeat large quarries, landfills, farms, and other large energy proposals while also improving Vermont's groundwater protection laws. She's lived off-grid with solar in Vermont for more than 20 years, hand milks a cow, has a flock of chickens, grows most of her own food, including citrus in a greenhouse, and seeks change through collaboration when possible and opposition when necessary. So first, thank you for all of your work, and second, thank you for being on the program.
Well, thank you, Derek. There is one update, which is now I've been doing this work for 18 years, so I guess it was 3 years ago that I was last on your program. Thanks for having me again.
Well, thank you for being on it again, and we should do it more often than every 3 years. So the first question is, how could anyone possibly be opposed to wind energy? and first off, what is wind energy, and how could any sane person not be absolutely in favor of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, 8 years of working on it, it's just become a 4-letter word for me, so I sort of approach it like, how can anybody be in favor of it after all I know? So, there are so many problems with wind energy, and the first one is how dishonest the developers are and what a fraudulent industry it is. The leaders of the American Wind Energy Association are excellent at their PR and press, but the members of AWEA are basically from the fossil fuel industry. And their methodologies for engaging communities are essentially the same as the fossil fuel industry does, which is externalizing the costs onto communities and leaving a lot of damage in the wake while taking a lot of profits out of the communities. So in Vermont, where we have small town communities, we have mountains, which are where the wind turbines are being placed, it involves real environmental destruction, in the destruction of entire ecological systems to create intermittent energy that still has to be backed up by fossil fuels. And that's another piece of it that the proponents never talk about. You know, now we're dealing with the idea that wind and solar can do it all as long as we have some batteries. Well, as someone who's lived off-grid, I can tell you that there are long periods of time when there is no sunshine and the batteries drain and you got to run the gasoline generator, or in New England it is the natural gas generator. And you have to have an equivalent backup system to produce all of the power that's needed for the times when there is no wind or sun. And we've had periods in New England where there have been periods where for 2 weeks at a time when there's been no sun and virtually no wind. And during those times, you've got to have the gas power plants, and it means more gas power plants. So there are all kinds of issues that it's really a very long list. They kill birds, they kill bats, they kill eagles, which is something that is not what house cats kill, and that's what the wind industry says is wind turbines kill fewer birds than house cats. Yeah, house cats don't kill bald and golden eagles. It's a very corrupting business because it has, especially under President Obama, resulted in our agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Agency, the forest, the national parks system, really abdicating their responsibility for their role in protecting the environment. And it's fascinating now to see the uproar about our current president and the potential for gutting environmental regulations when those of us who have been dealing specifically with the wind issue have seen the total gutting of our environmental protections for the wind industry. So we are kind of in a surreal place right now where maybe the federal agencies will actually be able to do their jobs. And that's what's happening in Vermont. We had a so-called Democrat liberal governor for 6 years, and we watched our state agencies totally corrupted and turned into a permit mill to enable both wind and solar, violating all kinds of long-standing precedent about environmental protection, but all supported by the green groups in the state, except for my organization, Vermonters for a Clean Environment. All the rest of them have said we've got to build wind energy to save the planet. So, okay, are wind turbines saving the planet? I haven't found any evidence that they are, yet, for instance, the wind turbines put up in Vermont, they're 21 3-megawatt Vestas turbines. Each one of those turbines contains 2 tons of rare earth minerals that are absolutely destroying one area in China. So there are environmental trade-offs that are not discussed, not talked about, and the more people learn about these issues, the more they become opposed to them.
You know, there is so much that you said that I want to ask you about particulars. And so I'm just going to sort of start picking at things to talk about. That was just so rich. Thank you for that. One of them is what you said about the Democratic governor and also Obama gutting regulations. And, you know, when I was an early activist, when I was a young activist, I remember George Bush the First swore that he wanted to gut the Endangered Species Act. Mm-hmm. And there was tremendous outroar about this. And then Clinton came in, and Clinton talked a good game, but meanwhile he defunded and really helped transform the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from an organization that had quite often been our ally to one that we quite often had to sue. Mm-hmm. And so that's a classic. I learned very early in my activist life that the Democrats and Republicans play a good cop, bad cop game, mm-hmm. Where you have somebody, you know, the Republicans will come in and bluster that we're going to destroy everything, and then the Democrats say they feel our pain as they go ahead and push forward the industrial desires anyway.
I know under President Obama, it was the all of the above energy policy, so everything was on the table to move forward. It's really amazing now to see the change that's taking place in Vermont, especially because we now have a Republican governor who has committed to stopping ridgeline wind development. And just last week, Middlebury College was in the news because they were going to host a speaker, a conservative speaker, who was opposed by a lot of the students. And there were protests, and the speaker was basically shut down, and it's created a black mark on the reputation of Middlebury College as this what's been depicted as an angry mob stopped the freedom of speech. And here I am thinking, well, Middlebury College, that is where Bill McKibben is the visiting scholar, and where he is the guru of Bernie Sanders and our former Governor Shumlin, and their approach to renewable energy, and especially wind energy, was we don't have the time to have that conversation. And so for 6 years, we weren't allowed to talk about the issues because the planet is burning and we have to build as fast as possible. And we saw the same thing going on the federal level, that anyone who opposed or raised any concerns about wind energy, we were called cave people. We were likened to creationists, and very fine scientists, climate scientists. If they said, it's the wrong thing to be doing, to be destroying intact ecosystems, can't talk about that, don't have time. And so it goes very much to the core of free speech, and the liberal Democrats need to look in the mirror and see themselves in what they're accusing the conservative Republicans of doing, because they've become just as right-wing as the right-wingers.
One of the things I find extraordinary is that you'll get I think that the whole, much of the climate change activist movement has made an extraordinary coup in environmentalism. And you might get 100,000 people marching on the streets of New York or Paris, and if you ask the individuals why they're marching, they say they want to save the planet. But if you ask them what their demands are, quite often their demands are for subsidies for the wind and solar industries. Mm-hmm. And so it's absolutely extraordinary to me that a mass movement has been made that acts as a lobbying organization for a sector of industrial capitalism.
Yeah. And one that isn't doing what they're claiming it's doing, yet people are willing to act on the belief. It's symbolic. It's like the 19th century book about the extraordinary popular delusions and the madness of crowds, where people get fixated on a specific object and they get entranced by it. And that's what the wind turbine, the spinning pinwheels up on the mountains, that's the symbol that we're doing something and we're saving the planet. And the level of destruction that occurs by doing this is something that I've been just astounded to see good, caring people willing to ignore or not want to learn about, because I guess they're coming from a place of fear where they're so afraid that we're not doing something, and so it's the easy thing to grab onto. It plays into people's fears.
So I want to go one of two directions, and you can go both directions if you want. One direction would be to talk more about that, and I'll have a question about this if you want it, the intermittent nature of wind, which I think is not well enough understood by people, and the other is the destruction it causes. So which direction would you like to go first?
Oh, let's talk about the intermittent nature of wind first.
Okay, so my question about that is, there's this article, you hear all the times, I know more about Germany than I do about Vermont in terms of this, because they call Germany the energy miracle, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll see headlines like, the other day, wind and solar provided 75% of Germany's energy, mm-hmm. stuff like that. They'll claim this all the time. Mm-hmm. And first, there's a confusion between energy and electricity. That electricity is only 20% of Germany's energy usage. And when they say 75%, they are actually saying 75% of 20%, because obviously wind is not the energy for people's cars or for boilers. So it's actually, you have to drop the number by 4/5 immediately. But the other thing is, and this just steams me, is that they'll say 75% of its electricity then, but they won't mention that this was for 1 hour on a Saturday when it was really sunny and really windy. And so there's this guy, Robert Wilson, wrote this great thing that Germany gets 3.3% of its energy from wind and solar. Hmm. And he says, when they say that there's a 75% of its electricity, what they're doing is they're taking 1 hour that happened on a windy, sunny May day, mm-hmm. and then extrapolating that to include, to act as though that's representative. But it's literally 3 or 4 or 5 standard deviations from the norm. And so I'm wondering if you can say this better. I'm not saying this very well, that it was stunning to me that they present this as being typical, but it's completely atypical. And also, when you're running an industrial society, and I don't think we need to run an industrial society, but we'll leave that aside for a second. When you run an industrial society, you need steady sources of energy. So having blotted on about that, can you just take it from there?
Well, I'm going to go to a place that you might be surprised by, but the single best depiction that I've seen of this problem was The Simpsons. And there was a show, you can find it on the internet, I think it was called The Whale and the Squirt, so it's a kind of a strange title. But part of the show, Homer Simpson goes to an energy fair and buys a wind turbine. And he brings it home and he sets it up. And he gets upset that he's still getting an electric bill. So he disconnects from the grid and he says, from now on, the Simpsons are going to live intermittently. And it's very funny. It has Bart and Lisa sitting up on top of the wind turbine, turning the blades so that Homer can watch football inside. It's really perfect to describe what the situation really is. So if you don't have storage, if you don't have a generator, so we can't look at one piece of technology in a vacuum. It's part of a system. And that's what I've learned by living off grid, is I've learned how the system works. And so what's happened in Germany is that they have overinvested in wind and solar with a lot of subsidies to make that happen, and then they decided to shut down the nuclear power plants. And what do you think they're doing? They are increasing their emissions because their baseload power is being developed through lignite coal. But their system of pricing was to charge a lot to manufacturers too, and those manufacturers have simply gone off grid. They're developing their own independent systems. And that's kind of where things are in a very interesting place where utilities are concerned and where the grid is concerned. I just finished reading a book called The Grid, which was very illuminating and helped me understand a certain amount about the whole plan. So where I am in Vermont, we're part of a region called the Independent System Operator of New England. Each region has a different ISO, and it has a different energy makeup. So the New England grid actually invested a lot in gas way back, which is what I got my start dealing with when a big gas power plant and pipeline project was proposed for Vermont back in 1999. And I kind of crawled out of the woods to fight that, fighting Governor Howard Dean, good liberal Democrat, wanting to expand gas in Vermont. But at the time, I learned that there were 57 gas plants proposed for New England. It was a mad dash for cash. Not all of them were going to be developed, and a lot of them did, though. So now the New England grid has something like 60% on a pretty daily basis. So you can find 60% of the electricity being provided by gas. The rest is, maybe 20% nuclear, and then there's some hydro and some biomass and other incinerator type things. But the gas really has taken off while the coal and oil plants are being shut down. And so are the nuclear plants. And so it's creating in some cases, a potential rolling brownout possibility because there isn't enough baseload power. And the grid operators are very worried about that. And the whole marketplace is changing, where it used to be that utilities made more money, the more power they sold. And now people are using less, and they're putting up net metered solar, and that is increasing the cost for people who have not net metered. People who do net metered solar often get their electric bill zeroed out, and the cost of maintaining the distribution and transmission system still has to be paid, and so that's being borne by the ratepayers who are still connected to the grid and don't have the benefit of investing in solar. So this whole disruption in the whole utility business is considered a bit of a death spiral. Vermont has perhaps the most innovative utility in the country, Green Mountain Power, which is attempting to change this. They all also are the developers of the Lowell wind project, which was the most destructive wind project we've seen, and they are buying the power for the Deerfield wind project, which is the first project in the Green Mountain National Forest, which my organization sued the U.S. government to try and stop, and we held it off. But this critical bear habitat in the Green Mountain National Forest is literally being destroyed by Iberdrola, the Spanish utility, right now. And so these wind projects that are being built in Vermont, to add another level of absurdity to it, are not being counted towards Vermont's renewable energy goals because they're selling the renewable energy credits out of state to Massachusetts and Connecticut, and they're using those to meet their goals. And then the utility says that's okay because it's keeping the rates down, and it's okay because it is adding power to the renewable power to the New England grid, even if you can't call it renewable in Vermont. So what happens now, think about, there was a 2-week period in December of 2014, which I think is a really good place to look at what really happens. Happened to be that there was no sun, hardly any wind, and Hydro-Quebec cut out for a period of that time too. And we had this massive, heavy, wet snow, and it was at a time when it was cold. And so here you're having peak power, like 25,000 megawatts in the regional load, and that load has to be met when there's no wind and there's no sun. And so you have to have a complete system to produce that 25,000 megawatts. So, okay, let's build 25,000 megawatts of wind and solar. You still have to have that 25 plus to back it up. And that's where this whole idea that we're going to get off fossil fuels breaks down, at least under the current technologies. And then the idea is we're going to have batteries. So Green Mountain Power has developed an innovative program where they're actually, people can pay something like $40 a month for a Tesla battery in their home. This helps the utilities. They would like to have batteries in people's homes or everybody driving an electric car. And that's going to your point about the total energy. If I were to talk in Vermont about how our percentage of our emissions is from electricity is like 5%, I would be told, well, you just are stupid. You don't understand that we're all going to be switching to air source heat pumps for heating our homes and to electric vehicles, and that will get us off fossil fuels. And then the utilities want the electric vehicle and batteries in the homes to be able to store power when the sun is shining in the daytime and when the wind is blowing at night. And then when everybody comes home from work at 5 to 8 o'clock at night, and that 6-hour period between 5 and 11 is what they're trying to meet, they can draw down your car battery, and that will shave off peak load. So the whole issue of peak load is the one that is driving the utilities to try and figure out how to meet the needs without having to build more power plants. But the problem is that you still have to meet that load when there's no sun and there's no wind, and we don't have the batteries yet or the electric cars to fulfill this fantasy. So what does that mean? It means building more gas generators. So the grid in New England is trying to figure out how to create incentives for the construction of new, big baseload natural gas generators that can supply that power, but also are flex generators that could ramp more efficiently than the current combined cycle generators that we have in New England. Right now, the most efficient gas plant we have in New England runs inefficiently when it ramps down to let the wind and solar in. So think car and traffic, it's burning gas. So as I've been evaluating this issue, which I've been most interested in of all the topics since I first started working on the wind issue 8 years ago, is, how is it saving fossil fuels? How is it that this intermittent resource can do what is being claimed? And I think the honest answer is, what I've learned is that on cold nights when the wind is blowing in the winter, then they can save some gas that they otherwise would have to buy. The downside of that gets to the next part of your choice of questions, which are, what are the impacts of doing that? And it turns out that that's when people need to sleep.
So I want to mention one more thing before we go to the destructiveness, which is that in addition to people driving electric cars and all that, you also have, and you mentioned this about Germany, you also have, individual use of energy is the smaller percentage. You also have industrial use. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the, from my perspective, absolute death knells for any possibility of, this is what makes that Jacobson guy's fantasies just fantasies, is that an industrial economy needs reliable energy. And that's the nice thing about oil, gas, hydro for that matter. And, mm-hmm. You know how much I hate hydro and mm-hmm. all these others. Mm-hmm. But you can just store the oil and then you burn it when you need it. And mm-hmm. so you can't have a factory that runs only when the sun is shining. That just doesn't work.
And so there are like hospitals and other businesses that are using fuel cells, and of course those currently run on gas. So one way or another, until we get some new technologies that break this cycle that we're in, fossil fuels are going to be a part of the energy mix. There is, some hope that storage will come along and become more ubiquitous, but it's not there yet. And there's a cost to all of this too. And having, invested in several battery banks, I can tell you it ain't cheap. So how this goes through on a grid scale, I don't know. And then, we're investing billions and billions of dollars in subsidies and into this technology of wind turbines that they claim they're going to last 20 to 25 years, and they apparently only last 10 to 15. And there's huge operations and maintenance issues. I do think that there's a greater potential for solar. I think that the breakthroughs that are happening in solar efficiency and economics will make it so that, in fact, we heard a wind energy insider say that in 5 years nobody's going to want to buy what we're selling. We're all going to be looking for work because the advances in solar are so great. So, and besides, he said they kind of have run out of stupid towns to sell their wares to.
So let's transition now to talking about the destructiveness of wind, and wind energy, and I would like to break that into two parts. One is the on-site destructiveness, and the other is the rare earth / Bautu / in manufacturing destructiveness. So whichever one you want to go through first, let's do that.
So we'll start with the manufacturing. I mean, this is a non-transparent business, and so we know what we know, but we don't know what we don't know. I mean, the towers are generally made in China, and they're made using coal. The steel comes from there, and then they're shipped over, and massive fossil fuel consumption just to get them here. The blades are made in various places. They're made of a resin. I have no idea how they're ever going to get disposed of. It's something you just don't talk about if you're in the industry. It is a massive problem because they're huge. And then the rare earth minerals come, I think 95% come from China, from one area of China, and it is completely destroying the environment for miles around and using large quantities, not just in wind turbines, but also it's what makes your smartphone vibrate. It's a component of electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, and it's an environmental impact that we need to be accountable for. Wind turbines also contain oil. I heard a story about one guy who his sole job was to climb to the top of the towers and mop up the oil. Some of them will claim they use biofuel, but I mean, you're talking about, with some designs, 100 gallons of oil sitting up on top of the nacelle, which is the sort of the bus-like thing at the top. And then you have, again, stories of what we've heard that had happens, and we don't have documentation on, but it makes perfect sense that the oil that's required to keep these things running aerosolizes with the fans, the turbine blades, and then puts out air pollution just from the oil in the immediate area too. So these kinds of of environmental impacts that are not seen and not talked about, there are probably more of them. But those are sort of the basics. The other issue that people talk about that we don't have any real solid facts on are that they actually have to draw electricity from the grid. And so when they are seeking wind, when they're turning, and when they're cold, they have to heat. They have to have oil and fluids to keep things lubricated and heated. We don't know how much actual power is being drawn from the grid during those times. So we don't really have an understanding of the full life cycle analysis of these. And another aspect of these is that some of the turbines, the Vestas that are up in Lowell, Vermont, and also the transmission system that serves the state, contains SF6, which is a greenhouse gas that's something like 20,000 times more potent than CO2. So there are other types of climate emissions, if you want to go there, that are associated with wind turbines. So then going to the environmental aspects that we have witnessed here in Vermont, we now have 3 operating projects and one that's another set of ridgelines being destroyed. The ridgelines currently being destroyed are critical bear habitat in southern Vermont in the Green Mountain National Forest. They aren't just bear habitat. They are the place, there's a bear cafeteria. They're the place that the bears all go to. And there are other ridgelines around, and they are doing a study, and so they've got tracking data, which I have seen. And the bears don't go to other ridgelines. This is where they go to feed, and now the core of the beech forest is being, got a road put through it, and will then have turbines put up that will put out noise levels of over 100 decibels at the bears' locations. So while they're finally doing a study on this fourth site, they should have done it on the first one, which is in Sheffield. These projects are being built in Vermont in very remote areas, and yet there are hundreds of people who live around them. And so they are the victims of this new effort to address climate change. I mentioned that on and have been sort of called out for how wrong that is by Bill McKibben, but it is an absolute fact that we are creating a whole new set of victims, very much like the frack gas industry going into rural areas and creating so much environmental devastation that the local people simply can't cope anymore. So we've seen massive amounts of ammonium nitrate fuel oil used on our mountaintops. That's the formula for blasting. And what we learned on the Lowell project site was they said they were going to use maybe 750,000 pounds of ANFO. They probably used 1 million, but of course we don't have the numbers. But the formula for blasting compounds is that for every 1 million pounds of ammonium nitrate, you need 9,000 gallons of fuel oil. So that's all injected into the ground at very high elevations. They blast it apart. They literally blasted the tops off of peaks. It is mountaintop quarrying. And having worked on quarry issues in Vermont, I've just been absolutely astonished by the wild west of blasting. They probably put off 25,000, 30,000 pound blasts up on top of the mountains, shook the areas for miles around. Completely uncontrolled as far as I'm concerned. And that disrupts all the headwaters. They've filled in hundreds of feet of Class A1 headwater streams above 2,500 feet, something never done in Vermont in the past, never imagined it would be done. We have a land use law called Act 250, which does not apply to these wind projects, and it prohibits this sort of destruction above 2,500 feet. The interior songbird habitat is degraded. The things that we've seen now that Lowell project started operating at the end of 2012, so 2013, 14, 15, 16, 4 years of operating. We did an investigation this past summer and found that the stormwater systems up there, both the traditional systems and the experimental systems, are both failing. There is acid flock, iron flock coming off of the sites, creating, and some of the failures are creating new stream channels. And at every storm, more and more of this is going to erode downhill. The monitoring program that was put in place as far as the stormwater permits were concerned are sacrificing the headwaters. All of the monitoring that's taking place is being done a mile or more off the peaks of the mountains. There are entire areas of forest that are dying. The mountain, which was cool and wet and damp and dripping with water and beautiful moss, and is now hot and rock and exposed. And so the trees are dying. And the road network, they built 2.5 miles of new road to get up to the top of the mountain, and those roads have to be the equivalent of an interstate highway because they have to hold equipment up to 200,000 pounds to drive those trucks up there with those heavy turbine towers and blades. So those are impervious surfaces, and the road, they did about a 4+ mile road along the ridgeline. Those are all now pathways for invasive species, so the response to that was to use herbicides. So they used 50 gallons of Roundup and another type of even more toxic herbicide right up there on the mountaintop and along the edges, and it's just going further and further into the forest every year, and it's at a really quite alarming rate the way the invasive species are coming in. And then there are, of course, the birds and bats, but the way that the operations are being monitored, it's generally that the wind company hires the experts and they do 2 years or so of monitoring, and then after that it's kind of the Wild West. The noise impacts for the wildlife are completely unevaluated, but the noise impacts for the humans are very serious, and all over the world people are complaining about the noise. Our governments are completely ignoring it. We just had a major breakthrough last week here in Vermont where, through a lot of pressure in the last legislative session, where Vermonters showed up wearing green vests day after day after day, forced the legislature to do something, which led to a rulemaking, and up until very recently was not going well, and we thought it's just more catering to the industry. Last Friday, they issued a new rule calling for a 35 decibel nighttime standard, which is what we were asking for. So there are things changing, but the education that we have gotten on the ground here has been really, really unbelievable, especially under a Democrat, supposedly, saving the planet type of regime that, thank goodness, ended. And we think that the election of the Republican governor who said he would stop wind development in Vermont was a big factor in his election, while his opposition was a Democrat who was committed to building more and more wind. And she lost by a much larger margin than anyone expected.
You mentioned bats, and I just read this article not very long ago on a bat conservation from a bat conservation organization that said that with hoary bats, Hoary, they're a fairly common sort of bat, that wind energy, this is a quote, wind energy will probably cause the hoary bat population to decline by 90% in the next 33 years. Can you talk about, apart from habitat destruction, which should be, anyone listening to this radio program should understand that if you put in an interstate, the equivalent of an interstate road, interstate highway, and put in these windmills and cut down trees and blast, they should understand that destroys habitat. But how specifically do they kill birds and bats, and why are ridgelines important to this?
Well, for the birds, these are the migratory routes for all kinds of birds, and they use the ridgelines, which as their routes for migrating. And what we've heard about from the neighbors around these projects is that the wildlife are gone. The birds are ravens, crows, all kinds of songbirds. People just aren't seeing them anymore. Similarly, also with the raptors. But what happens when they do come in contact with the wind turbines is that they collide with them and they get killed. A lot of these mountains can be engulfed in, enveloped in clouds, and so there's new obstacles, and it's really tragic. And the amount of these types of birds that are being killed is hidden by the industry. There's a wildlife expert named Jim Wiegand who is very articulate and has really been digging into this, and he's gone quite public about what a fraud it is and how many tens of thousands of eagles are being harmed. So the bats, the way that they die is that the air is pressurized by these wind turbines. This is something that most people really don't understand about how this, when you talk about the noise, it's not really a noise per se, it's not just audible noise, but the wind turbines actually, think about a fan. Now you have this spinning blade, and every time the blade passes the tower, it creates what's called amplitude modulation, and they send out these vortexing barometric pressure waves. And so what happens to the bats when they come into contact with that barometric pressure is it actually explodes their lungs.
Oh my God. Here's the quote on the study that was recently put out, including biologists and academics from several federal agencies, The study used conservative figures for bat fatalities, 128,000 hoary bat fatalities annually in the U.S. and Canada, and that's assuming no new wind turbines come online. So this study here is saying, I'm looking at it right now, 128,000 hoary bats, it's only one type of bat, that 128,000 hoary bat fatalities in the U.S. and Canada. That's an extraordinary number. With a population, the total hoary bat population, the highest possible population is 10 million currently. And
now we have in Vermont, the little brown bat, which was more than 90% wiped out by white nose syndrome. When the Deerfield Wind Project was coming along, I actually attended the U.S. Forest Service's open house in a Batman costume. It was very interesting to go because it enabled me to be anonymous, and I was raising concerns about the bats that we can't afford to lose any more little brown bats. Vermont has now listed as endangered, I think, 3 or 4 species of bats: the big brown bat, the little brown bat, and I think there's a third type. And how many more bats can we lose to wind turbines? But what the federal government does is allow takings permits with bald eagles under Obama. One of the things they got through at the end of the Obama administration was a 30-year eagle take permit. Absolutely outrageous. And, no wind energy company has ever been fined really for the killing of these eagles. It's hard for me to talk about, actually. It's like and the fact that we are having this conversation is interesting, but anybody who believes that wind turbines are going to save a planet will just tune it out. We just don't have time to talk about this. And so how do we bring some rationality back to this? It's very disturbing to get into the details of what is actually happening around, whether it's ridgeline wind or whether it's farm fields in the Midwest where people are experiencing the same kinds of issues but in a different way, and where we have all kinds of bird and bat populations all over the world being exposed to these things, and the goal of the wind industry is to build more and more and more of them. Something has to change to stop the destruction, because as you point out, there's even if we don't build any more, it's a massive amount of destruction of our ecological systems.
So it's we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, and it seems to me that a couple of things. One is I keep thinking, as you've been talking, I keep thinking about one of those phrases we hear from the Vietnam War where they
yep.
destroyed the village to save it.
Yep.
And they keep talking about how, we need to sacrifice this area in order to save the earth. There was a headline I saw a few years ago about a big solar facility that they said, destroying the desert to save the earth. Mm-hmm. And there's some sneakiness, some terrible sneakiness is going on right there, because this is not actually saving the earth, because the desert tortoises don't actually need the electricity. What this is doing is saving industry and saving this way of life.
Well, the other thing it's doing on the capitalist model is it's enriching the 1%, because the way a lot of these projects are financed, there is no risk at all to the investors, but they are making huge amounts of money with the investment tax credit. For instance, with solar projects, if you have a big tax bill, instead you can put it into renewable energy, and then you get a nice return on investment of 6 or 7%. That's not available to the rest of us, and that's what's financing these solar projects. The wind production tax credit, that's billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer money, all of which is enriching, the likes of Goldman Sachs and D.E. Shaw and the big investment banks. It's not in any way energy democracy or anything equitable. But when I look for hope and for signs of change, I actually got one this year. Total surprise to me, but the Burlington Free Press, which has not ever been friendly to us on the wind issue, surprised a lot of people by finding that I was the 2016 Vermonter of the Year.
Well, congratulations.
Well, thank you. And it was a total surprise. Last year it went to the CEO of Green Mountain Power. The year before it went to Bill McKibben. So this is a newspaper out of the, supposedly green town of Burlington that gets its 100% renewable claim by selling the renewable energy credits for solar and wind out of state and buying low value hydro credits from Maine. Kind of a scam. But for them to find me Vermonter of the Year was really quite interesting from the perspective of what that means. That here my work was, and the editor called me and he said that you're so effective they tried to shut you down. Well, last year I was brought under criminal investigation by the Vermont Attorney General for allegedly practicing law without a license, for helping people participate in the only regulatory process that the state has for citing renewable energy. And it was the attorneys and the developers of renewable energy that brought this claim against me. And it was entirely to try and shut me down. And their efforts failed really spectacularly. I was called a hero by 5 different newspapers. One said newspaper editorials, one said if she's a pain in the neck, more power to her. And when the editor called me, he said, you're so effective that, they tried to put you out of business. And I am helping raise the voices of people to have a say in what goes on in our communities. And so that's really hopeful, that there is recognition that the people and the environment need to be a part of this discussion, and we need to be respected and have a voice. And so that acknowledgement I don't take personally. I take it as great recognition for the people who are willing to stand up and speak up for doing things the right way and not shutting people down, but having a voice.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for your work. Is there anything else that you would like to say before we close?
Well, I just want to thank you, Derrick, for your work and for the shining the light on the capitalist model that is failing us miserably right now, and the massive ongoing environmental destruction that is being wrought in the name of saving the planet through renewable energy. And the more that we can do to educate people, we find that you don't have to lobby or anything. The more people learn, the more that we can change the systems so that we can have a healthy and happy planet. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. And that would be a nice place to close, but I want to read 2 quick paragraphs from an editorial that you sent me, and somebody else sent me too, by Susanna Jones, that I think apply to this. I'm going to read these, and then if you want to have a quick comment, that's great. If not, that's fine too. Okay. And she's talking about, unfortunately, Mr. McKibbin's, but more broadly, the sort of bright green environmentalism is no longer about protecting the land base from the ever-expanding empire of humans. It's about sustaining the comfort levels that Americans feel entitled to without totally exhausting the resources required. It's entirely human-centered and hollow, and it serves corporate capitalism well. This version of environmentalism has been successfully mainstream, but at the cost of its soul. Sacrifice is needed, but those sacrifices should no longer come from the natural world. They should come from us, from our materialistic way of life, from the bloated economy and those who profit from it. So I just want to thank you for bringing that to my attention, and the other person sent it to me too. And I would also like to thank you for manifesting that and for standing in defense of the natural world.
Susanna is one of 6 people who on their own individually decided to go up on the Lowell Mountains in civil disobedience and get arrested to try and stop the destruction and to bring attention to it. She's a real hero, and she says it so well.
Well, I would like to thank you for your great work, and I would like to thank you for being on the program. I'd like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Annette Smith. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.